And I would like to move that Amendment A1 to Bill 50, the Electric Statutes Amendment Act 2009, be amended as follows.
It is now known as a sub-amendment SA2.
And we will now refer to it as Subamendment SA2. And, honourable members, you have it in front of you. And I don't think that I necessarily need to read it for you. It'll be in the record as it is, and you can read it for yourselves. But let me speak to it briefly, and then hopefully get some debate going. And again, I admit, Mr. Chair, that I would prefer not to be bringing this sub-amendment in, because this sub-amendment does not do everything that I would like a sub-amendment to do. We tried that before and failed on that. This sub-amendment merely takes a bill that I still see as fundamentally and badly flawed and tries to make it a little less so. But it essentially, it amends Section 2 and subsection 2A by striking out the proposed Clause F1 and substituting the following. Critical transmission infrastructure means a transmission facility designated under the schedule as critical transmission infrastructure. And B, in subsection 6, by striking out the proposed Section 41.1, and in the proposed Section 41.3 by striking out and an order under Section 41.1 sub 1. So what does all this do? Well, what this does is limit the amount of critical transmission infrastructure to only those lines in what would be the schedule to the Electric Utilities Act, Section 2, sub 13 of Bill 50. Okay? Just what's listed in the schedule on page 11 of this bill. Well, why would we want to do that? Well, for this reason. By bringing in a government amendment that seeks to stage the development of the various pieces of transmission infrastructure that the government has designated as critical in this bill, the government is acknowledging that not all of the most critical of critical transmission infrastructure needs to be built right away, that you can stage it. You can do it in stages. You can do first one, then another, then another, then another. Well, if that is true, and I believe it to be, then it follows logically that the other pieces of the grid, as proposed in the AESO's 10-year plan, all of which could become critical transmission infrastructure, the way the bill reads now, do not need to ever be labeled as critical. What they need to have done is they need to be subjected to a process that gets everybody going and working in a timely and organized fashion, so that when today the AESO says, you know what, 3 or 4 years down the road, we're going to need that line from point A to point B, they start the process now taking into consideration, doing the backdating, doing the math, how long it takes to go through the needs identification process and get approval there, then how long it takes to let the contract, to go through the siting hearings, to actually start building the thing to the point where you flip the switch and you energize the line and everything's good and Bob's your uncle, right? Whatever that period of time is, I'm sure it's very, very predictable, very easy to project that over a timeline. And I understand from conversations that I've had with the minister and conversations that I've had with other people that part of the reason why we're dealing with Bill 50 right now is because that process kind of went off the rails about 4 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago. So much as I would far rather that we just voted this whole bill down as a bad bill and started again, I realize that's not going to happen. When my sub-amendment was defeated yesterday and last night, I realized that the wagons have been drawn into the circle, the ranks have been closed, and this thing is going through in one form or another, come you-know-what or high water. And so now I'm saying, well, then why don't we take a more logical approach to this and say, we're going to cut you some slack for the sake of argument here. We're going to say, okay, let's say the high voltage lines between Edmonton and Calgary, the high voltage lines between Calgary and between Edmonton and Fort McMurray, the line to the Gibbons Redwater area, the new substation in southeast Calgary, in the southeast Calgary area, all those things. Let's accept, for argument's sake, those are critical transmission infrastructure. You should, and that you're behind the 8 ball on this, that you should have started this process 2 or 3 or 4 years ago. We'll cut you some slack to fast-track this process, but the rest you can organize so that it can all go through the full process that it's supposed to go through, which means it gets heard, it gets a full independent regulatory hearing in front of an independent Alberta Utilities Commission, and that commission decides whether that line and its social, economic, and environmental impacts are in the public interest should it be built in the first place. Well, that's not me, and I'm very glad to hear that that's not my phone ringing. And so, you know, I think this is a sub-amendment that everyone in this House and everyone involved in the electrical transmission industry and the generating industry feeding into those lines and the distribution industry coming out the other end of those lines should be able to live with. Because this is nothing more than a sub-amendment that says we recognize that you may have gotten behind the 8 ball a few years ago, and now you need to play catch-up so that things don't go off the rails and we don't find ourselves in a situation where we might experience power shortages, critical power shortages. But having done this, and you've already yourselves, on the advice of the experts you keep referring to at the ASO, you've already laid out what those really, truly critical pieces of transmission infrastructure are, and even at that, through your own amendments, you are now proposing that they're not all of equal criticality, that some can be built first and others can follow. So let's cut you that slack, let you do that, but let's put in effect a sunset clause on this notion of criticality and say, once this is done, Bill 50 is done, for all intents and purposes, and everything else can proceed the way it's supposed to proceed. So this amendment, this sub-amendment of mine, would kill the automatic regulatory needs hearings bypass after this list on page 11 of the bill is built, or after the process to get it approved for building is started. The government would instead have to add the infrastructure to the schedule through legislation, limiting their ability to just jam things through without public scrutiny, or they would have to just simply say to the transmission facility operators, okay, you want to build a line from Peace River because someday somebody might put a nuclear plant up there, or because, you know, a nuclear plant has been licensed for there, or whatever, or you want to build a line from the Northwest Territories because the Slave River hydroelectric project is underway, or is about to become underway. Okay, best get going on getting that organized now so that the lines are ready to be energized when the dam is built or when the nuclear plant is built and the power is ready to start flowing. It's got some place to go. Much of the government's rationale is that the current needs identification approvals process takes some time, and we need this critical transmission infrastructure too badly now to go through that whole process. If that is the case, and this sub-amendment in effect gives them that by, right?
Very fair.
If that is the case, then there should be no need for the government to have to leave the door open for any more transmission projects to get bundled through as critical transmission. The government, the ASO, the transmission facility operators should have all learned their lesson and can in the future put the needs identification document into the process early enough to go through the process as it should. That is the rationale behind this sub-amendment, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to debate on this, and I hope that members from all sides will join the debate on this sub-amendment, since we only got members from the opposition side to debate my last sub-amendment. Let's have at her, and we'll see where we go with this. Thank you.
Honourable member for Leader of the Third Party on Sub-Amendment A2.
Yes, thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. On Sub-Amendment S.